Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Himvar, and today I wanted to do an entry in a new series that I was thinking would kind of border the things I like to talk about. This is, of course, speculative fiction and philology, or words rather. Um, and how I'm going to do that is I'm going to call this series, at least I'm thinking I'm going to call it Word Museum. And then I'll have some subtitles for each episode, and I'll try to keep these relatively short. And so I wanted to take like a word and just kind of vaguely look at it, just real quick, connect it to fantasy and some literature, but also look at the word like in relation to potentially some other words. Excuse me. I thought that would be more fun. And so the one that was largely on my mind were elves. Of course, elves are largely popularized by Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. They're in Dungeons and Dragons as playable character, of course, or playable race for your player character. Um, but if you look at myth, they're kind of confusing characters because it seems like sometimes they're considered in a good light and other times they're considered in a poor light. So I just wanted to look at basically some of the associations. I'm not going to deep dive in any of them, but I just wanted to like bring them forward. I'll also look at some names, particularly Anglo-Saxon names, since we're speaking English. Anglo-Saxon is Old English. Um, And so, yeah, so the word elf comes from the word alf, Old English word alf, which is actually a Mercian dialect. The West Saxon version of elf would have been Eilf, but alf was pretty popular in their West Saxon names, even. Um, elf is an interesting word as it is related to some other words. So, elf, I'm not going to give you the whole etymology because I feel like y'all would think that's boring, but I'll show you some of the comparisons that you can get from, the philology essentially. So the word elf is related to the word albus, which is Latin for white, like Albus Dumbledore. You also have Albion, which is an ancient name for Britain. Probably a reference to white cliffs, like the cliffs of Dover and such like that. The Alps, the mountains, of course, probably because they're white, they're shining right on the top. And then oaf, which is a doublet actually of elf from Old Norse. Oaf, originally meaning beyond elf, like changeling essentially. So a changeling would be an oaf, right? A stumbling fool or something like that. So you have ideas like elf shot, which is like a sickness. Um, then you have like elf addled kind of, so it's called alfadl. And then Ylfi, which is insane, which seems like it just means elfy. And then Ylf Sidon, which is elf magic. Ylf Sogotha, which is the hiccups. Ylf Thona, which is nightshade, actually. There is a word that I like, actually, particularly. I've written about this concept in poetry and in short stories, actually, called Alfshina, which is elf sheen. This is used as an example, I believe, to describe Judith in the Old English, Judith, which is in the same codex as Beowulf is found, and just means beautiful, right? So elf beauty, essentially. And so then you have names like Alfred, of course, which are doublets with Alfredo and Avery, if you're curious. Uh, it just means elf council. This does not mean like elven council or even necessarily like council of elves. The Anglo-Saxons had a tendency to use two words and put them in a name. Sometimes you get words that are just like a single thing. Like the one I always come up with is Eowr, which just means boar, right? It's just one word, right? But like Beowulf, particularly, most people look at it as Beowulf or barley servant, maybe, depending on how you look at that. And so yeah, they're just like words that are not like necessarily related. They're just words that are like for some reason they used, right? And then some people didn't use different things. So like I believe the name, like my name Liam, is Wilhelm in Old English, but it's never attested actually. I think it's Will is never attested in Old English. I could totally be wrong on that. But it appears in Old English as Wilhelm, but only after the Norman conquest. Um, and stuff like Day Raven in or Dairahaven and Beowulf, we can tell is a Frankish name because Raven is not really one of those pieces that is used in Anglo-Saxon names, and not really used, I believe, in any other Germanic groups' names, essentially. If I'm remembering correctly. Again, this is all stuff I read about a while ago. But then you also have names like Alvin, which is Alfruina, means elf friend, Alfstan, which means elf stone, um, Alfgifu, which is elf gift, of course. This is actually a female name, and is borrowed actually into Norse and gives us the modern Icelandic name, I think, Alfifa, I think. And then Alfric, of course, which is elf ruler, Rick, meaning like reach or Reich, like in German. Um, Reich, 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 I think it's correct. I don't know. Anyways, correct my German, someone. Um, and then Elfrida, of course, elf strength. It's a female name again. Alfwerd, which is elf guard. Alcia, which is elf victory. Alfhera, which is elf army. Hera, like oh, Walter, on Walter Harold as well. And then Alfhelm. So there's helm. So they use helm, which is elf helm, exactly what it means. And then Alfiet, which is elf gate. Might be Gate. I don't know. It looks like Gate. Anyways, so we do have like different attestations of elves. We have like the mountain elves, which are called Danelven. And what else? Like the Rudra Elfa. And you can use them to translate. I believe these are actually used to translate things like nymphs and different types of nymphs, basically from classical myth. You also have like elves, and there maybe their association with Freyr. It's not 100% agreed on that Freyr is Lord of Elves, but there is a line in Beowulf 1313, actually, if I remember correctly, is where he is called the elf ruler. That is often amended to all ruler. Elf ruler makes sense, though, in some contexts, just how Freyr is associated with elves and like the Dwergtal and stuff like that. So elf ruler potentially is Freyr. Freyr is a title, by the way. It's Freya in Old English, just means Lord. His name is Ingwi, I believe, in Old Norse. It's Ing in Old English. Ing would have been his name. So, anyways, and then you have, of course, the modern elves, like found in the King of Elfland's Daughter. Probably the earliest one. I could be wrong on that. And then that's by Dunsany, of course. I have not read that yet. That's on my list. Then there's, of course, The Hobbit, which came out after Dunsany stuff. And of course, you have The Broken Sword by Paul Anderson as well, which is definitely taken from the Norse stuff. So elves and Tolkien, of course, are he preferred the older version, right, of Elven versus Elfin, just like dwarf versus dwarves. This comes from, again, the Old English, where there is no V character in Old English if you read Old English. But if there's an F and it is medial, then it is said like a V, right? So elf, there's nothing after elf, but if it's elfis, it's elvis, right? Because there's an S, right? So it becomes a V sound. That's basically the case with, they become voiced, essentially, is what it is. That's Old English for you, essentially. So he's like, oh, they're not elves, they're elves, essentially, right? So, and that's just him being archaic in a sense. It's kind of like leaf and leaves, essentially. So, excuse me. Let's see. Oh yeah, the Old English plural would not have been elvis; it would have been elva. But well, one version of the plural at least. Anyways, so the standard plural s would come later after many things. But maybe that gets you a better idea of elves as far as the word goes, and maybe a little bit of the history and context about elves. Why Tolkien maybe did what he did. Tolkien definitely popularizes the idea of elves, but they were a thing before Tolkien, of course, and they're a little confusing one. So it's always interesting to see how people explore elves, how they are treated in fantasy crafting, essentially. So, anyways, it's been Liam Williams Lyceum, my first episode of Word Museum. Hopefully that was helpful, or at least interesting. I will catch you next time.